I'm Chad,
I'm Khalil.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. All right, to start this one off, I'd like to recap what we talked about in our first episode on ethno-nationalism. In that one, which we'll have up there in the info, we talked about the ideas of what a nation is, what nationalism is, what ethnicity is, and then what race is. And then that led into a conversation on what um, we'll be talking about more in this one is what is ethno-nationalism. So again, in our last one, we really dissected the ideas of ethnicity, in which it's a group of people with a shared culture, religion, and language, and then sometimes shared geographical area. And we compared that to the idea of race, which is the idea of grouping people together due to shared physical characteristics, and then assuming a shared cultural background that had some elements of ethnicity. And we really deconstructed the idea of a race and showed kind of the absurdity of it. And so, if you want to hear a little more about that, you could go check out our last video. But in this episode, we'll be touching more on the ideas of what ethno nationalism itself is. And I feel it's important to do so, and the real ability to do so comes from understanding the two main ideas that come with nationalism. The two like kind of branches of thought that we have with nationalism are civic nationalism and cultural nationalism. And as I get into those, I believe it's important to understand the difference between the two, because if we want to understand whether like current leaders today are in fact ethno-nationalist, or rather are they civic nationalist, or simply theocratic leaders or things of that sort, it's important to understand the differences between these two ideas, because we can greater understand their motives and understand what their visions are for the future. And with that, I'd like to start out with defining the first branch of thought when it comes to nationalism, and that is the idea of civic nationalism. So, civic nationalism essentially is a shared national sentiment, shared because you live within a country's borders. And so, greater defined by Princeton professor Anna Stilz, civic nationalism is meant to describe a political identity built around shared citizenship in a liberal democratic state. So, as I said, what this basically means is that there is a shared unity, there's a shared understanding, and a shared idea of a culture that's built around the people who live within a specific state. An idea that comes with this is the phrase "jus solis," or the right of the soil. I probably butchered the pronunciation, but the right of the soil. So basically, when you're within the borders of a nation, an established country with a state and a government, you are part of that nation. You're part of the group who is most important in the world. And that's what nationalism is. And so with civic nationalism, because you are within that state, you are what is most important. You are say, an American, or you are a French person, or you are a Russian. And so because of you're within the Russian Federation, you are all on the same page, and you as a Russian citizen, or you as the Russian people of the state of Russia, not the ethnic group, and that will be when we define more of what is cultural nationalism. You, as say a Russian citizen of the Russian state, are what is most important on the world stage.
Right. And so with this idea of civic nationalism, ideally there would be no exclusion,
Hmm.
whether it be for things that they can change or things that they especially can't change, that there ideally would be no exclusion, no other, so of course there are societies that accept civic nationalism that have not done this very well, to say the least,
Yeah.
like America, we have said, like American leaders have said since the beginning of the foundation of the state, um, that we are a nation that accepts all people, but they were very limiting in what that meant, the people. And so there
Hmm.
was a lot of exclusion. when America, even from its founding principles, was supposed to be a nation upon which civic nationalism was accepted, where everybody within the nation would live under the laws and rules of that state and would be treated the same, and everybody would feel themselves as being like very together and very brotherly because they live within the same borders and live under the same rules. But of course, in practice, it hasn't been like that.
Yeah, with civic nationalism, what you essentially do is you create an artificial culture that supposedly everyone within the country's borders is automatically included upon. And so for America, it would be that as soon as you were to enter America's national soil or were to cross the border line, you are now an American. You subscribe to the American culture. And so this culture is different than the culture of ethnic groups. So like the culture of the Slavic people. That is a culture of a group of people who eventually could come to form their own states and governments and have different customs, but they as a people have this culture. With civic nationalism, what it does is that it creates a culture for that country. Everyone within this country subscribes automatically, or should subscribe, to this idea of the American culture, and therefore not the cultures that they were originally coming into or joining the country with. And so with civic nationalism, what you get is with proponents of it, they argue for the idea of assimilation, so that people, as we said, America has ideally is should be very welcoming to immigrants. We are a nation of immigrants. People came here from different countries, and that's how we have our strength. But um, one of the things that comes with that is the idea of other groups assimilating into this greater American culture. And so when you get with civic nationalism, you get people who argue that immigrants, people who are come from different ethnicities, different racial groups, all of that, they are welcome and fine as long as they assimilate into the national culture. They join the national culture.
So it really is still nationalism to have the
Hmm.
idea that you must assimilate to the idea, no matter how liberal we think it is. The idea that you must be this, that you must speak this language, that you must act a certain way. Because it's one thing, when we all agree upon a certain set of laws and rules, that makes sense, that we would all have this certain civic mindset of like helping the community, but forcing language, forcing very restrictive rules, you know, that is where the nationalism starts to come in. And in a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, which Chad is gonna read out, we do see a little bit of reflection of the age in 1907 when this quote was written out. Um, that there was still that sense of nationalism at the time of like you must conform to American society, but he also talks about language as being something that must be assimilated into. So civic nationalism is still nationalism, but at least it's not something that cannot be changed.
Yeah. And so with that, we have a fantastic quote from former President Teddy Roosevelt on his view of immigration and the idea of assimilation. Um, Khalil, you could bring up the slides if you like. And so with this quote, it reads as, in the first place, we should insist that if the immigrant who comes here in good faith becomes an American and assimilates himself to us, he shall be treated on an exact equality with everyone else, for it is an outrage to discriminate against any such man because of creed, or birthplace, or origin. But this is predicated upon the person's becoming in every facet an American, and nothing but an American. There could be no divided allegiance here. Any man who says he is an American, but something else also, isn't an American at all. We have room for but one flag, the American flag. We have room for but one language here, and that is the English language. And we have room for one soil loyalty, and that is loyalty to the American people. And so this right here is what I see as a perfect example of the civic nationalist importance in assimilation. So what he says here is that people who come to America, immigrants, are completely fine. But what's important here is that they assimilate into the American culture, is that there cannot be, as he says, there can be no divided allegiance here. When it comes to being an immigrant, you still have your ideas of, well, for one, you have your ethnicity, you have the country that you're coming from, you have your old nationhood, your old citizenry, all that kind of stuff. But what Teddy Roosevelt here advocates for, and therefore what the civic nationalist advocates for, is the throwing away of those old ideas. In that, as soon as you step into the borders of the United States, you must follow you must follow the culture of the American people. When you're inducted into the culture of the American people, you must follow that. There cannot be any divided allegiance to any other old country or old group or old, maybe even family members. There is only the American culture. There's not your own singular ethnicity, race, language. As you can see here, he advocates for the adoption of one language, being the English language, which he sees as something intrinsic to American culture. But at the end of the day, he emphasizes that the good treatments of immigrants is dependent on their assimilation to the culture of the country that they immigrate to. And that's one of the biggest, I wouldn't say caveats, but one of the biggest characteristics of civic nationalism is that anyone who comes to that country is fine. There's not that kind of exclusionary in that only people of this country are important, or of this ethnic group are important, but everyone who comes here has to get on the same boat. And that's kind of what civic nationalism sees as the most important aspect for people who come here.
And of course, that was looking at the aspects of this that we would not agree with today, which would be a lot. Um, but really just looking at the language part, that really is a reflection of the time of 1907, that it was very, very focused on like spreading a certain oneness of the American people, not respecting, for example, like languages of Native American people, or Spanish or German, Russian, Italian, whatever.
Yeah, the
Um,
immigrants.
yeah, exactly. So, like, the idea that you only speak the English language because America used to be an English colony, and most people speak English, 80% of Americans speak English anyway. And so there's this idea that you must assimilate into that group, which is something we would never agree with. And also, we wouldn't agree with today for the most of us. Um, then, of course, 1907, the idea of civic nationalism. Um, in how you're going to ideally not exclude. Remember, this is 1907. Teddy Roosevelt was very different, a president at the time, for that one time that he brought in, I think it was Booker T. Washington into the White House, and so he did that for that one time, but this was still a very racist time in America's history, you know, um, much more than it is today. And so
Yeah,
there are certain caveats to like examples today of civic nationalism and how it doesn't really act in the way that it's supposed to, but at least there are nations like America that, as time has gone on, has tried to stay as true to the belief as possible.
yeah, absolutely. And to kind of summarize the line of logic of the civic nationalist is that, using the example of America, which we've used very often, um, you are within America's borders, so therefore you are American, and with that, America is first. That is the line of what a civic nationalist would follow. Because people are within the borders of the state, you are now inducted into the culture or the people of the nation, and then add on the nationalism, in which that group of people the most important. The people within that state, within the borders of that state, and are therefore of that culture of that state, the American culture, they are the most important. They are first. America first, as the slogan goes.
Right. So the next example that we have is um, cultural nationalism, which really unites its people along a shared national sentiment that is bound before the existence of a state. And there are examples of this in history that are most prevalent, like Italy, Germany, like fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Um, but then there's also modern examples that we gave examples for earlier, but didn't really expand upon. We'll expand later, like Hungary, to a certain extent, Russia today. What are the other ones? We had Turkey, China. Um, yeah, like examples of modern ethno-nationalists, like Yugoslavia back in the 90s, 80s and 90s. Um, yeah, just the idea of jus sanguinis, I think it is jus sanguinis, that is the right of blood. So um, that basically is the slogan upon which cultural nationalism is developed, in that the nation is bound by blood. The nation is not bound by anything that you can change, like language or anything. No, it's a very Hitlerian way at looking at things, and Hitler adopted this wholeheartedly with the quote that we I believe we actually said earlier in our series of far left equals far right, um, um, and that is the German people are united by blood, not just by language. And so, yeah,
Yeah,
using the right of blood.
yeah. With cultural nationalism as opposed to civic nationalism, the people who are most important are not just the people within the borders of some state. It's not just, the citizens of the United States or people who are within the borders of the United States. It is the ethnic group. It would be say there was a hypothetical group, the ethnic Americans, or you could consider that as, the Native Americans. With cultural nationalism, the unity is the ethnicity. It is the group of people that inherently is exclusionary. With civic nationalism, you could change that. You could leave the country that you are living in. You could change your citizenship from being an American. You could go to Germany. You could go to France. You could change that. You could speak a different language. You could automatically have a different history or believe in a different religion. With cultural nationalism, what that unity is, it is only for the people of whatever specific ethnic group it is. And so, as we said, one of the greatest examples of that is Nazi Germany and their idea of the supremacy of the so-called Aryan race. And so for them, that was a perfect example of cultural nationalism, which basically directly translates into ethnic nationalism in that the Aryan people, so people within this ethnic group, people only of this ethnic group, are the most important. It's not people who live in the state of area, if that was even a thing. It's the people who are of the Aryan ethnic group, and only them.
Right. Because with Germany, with Hitler, is that he was very expansionist, of course, like during World War II and then the years leading up to it. He was all about expanding and taking over new territory. And most interestingly, though, in the years leading up to World War II, and actually in the last days leading up to World War II, he was always justifying his expansion in the era of the 30s, called today the appeasement era. The appeasement policy adopted by the Western powers is that they would let Hitler expand into nations surrounding Germany, the borders of Germany, because there were ethnic Germans that needed to be part of Germany, because after World War One, Germany shrunk, and there were people that had always been part of a German state that are now part of separate states, that were part of separate states after World War One. And so the Western leaders in the time of the 20s and 30s, and especially the 30s as Hitler gained more power, um, he would justify his expansion into those territories, whether it be Czechoslovakia or Poland or areas near the French border, by saying we're just trying to protect the ethnic German people, and that's something you can always say when you are the dominant nation of an ethnic diaspora. That's what Russia is doing right now by consistently, that's what Putin is doing right now, consistently referring to the Russian speaking peoples in Ukraine or and I bet soon we might hear it in Kazakhstan because there's a 25% ethnic minority in Kazakhstan, and in Belarus or in Estonia or Poland, or all around the borders of Russia. It's a way of projecting power that we've mentioned in our previous series again, and far left equals far right, that an ethnic diaspora is a perfect excuse, if it's a perfect excuse even today, of projecting power and influence. In the same way how Hitler said, we're trying to unite the German people. Putin is always having that little trump card that he can pull and say, oh, you're doing things against the Russian speaking peoples. That's why when the language law that Zelensky passed in 2019, 2020, I think it was, maybe even 2021, you know, which um, which made Ukrainian mandatory in schools, didn't ban Russian in public life or in
Yeah, they
schools.
can still speak it.
Right. It just required that Ukrainian be spoken in schools because you live in Ukraine, you know. And Putin interpreted this as being like harsh legislation that would get rid of the rights of Russian-speaking peoples to speak Russian. And so it was at least publicly one of the things that he would use to attack the modern Ukrainian government, the Zelensky government, which partially led to his invasion. Just projecting power because of this ethnic diaspora in Russia being the dominant power of that diaspora, same as how Hitler was in the 30s.
Yeah. And so going back to the idea of nationalism, for the ethnic nationalist, the ethnicity is the most important. For Hitler, say, this is kind of the line of logic in comparison to what we said for civic nationalism. For Germany, for the Hitler, he would say, you are Aryan, and therefore Aryan is first. And the state is formed around that idea. The state is formed around that culture of that ethnicity, as opposed to the culture being formed around the state that is already existing. And that's what you get with cultural nationalism.
And real quick, he referred to the ethnic German people often as the Aryan people, but anyway.
Yeah. And so with that line of logic, since those people are the most important, you follow through with whatever needs to be done in order to ensure that greatness or to bring more people into your ethnic Aryan, ethnic German state. And this whole idea of basing an entire country or basing an entire idea off of an ethnicity is what makes it incongruent with, society or the order that we have today for the world. So ethnicities have always existed and they've always developed along with nations throughout history. And usually, the nations would last because they would end up being ethnically homogenous. They'd usually be a nation of mainly Germanic peoples or something like that. But that's just how they ended up forming. They weren't forced. But however, after the rise of things like the rise of liberalism, and especially after the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, the idea was presented to the Western world that countries should form their own borders, and they can do so on whether they want it to be ethnically homogenous, or they could do so on, creating a country for the liberal idea. Um, and so through countries, and especially Europe, the idea of creating ethnically homogenous nations gained a lot of popularity. And that's where we had a lot of countries kind of grasp onto this nationalism because they saw themselves as an ethnic group who, as most important of the world, deserve their own state. And what makes it complicated is that the borders of that state would so-called just be the borders of the people. And people in the Western world, people in the 20th to 21st century, things have changed so much that people, they're spread out. People don't just live, the Germanic people don't just live in Germany. You have Germans in Russia, you have Germans in the United States, you have Germans in probably even North Africa. And so if you seek to create a state only for those people, your borders are going to be very messy. And the modern liberal order that we have for the world is that nations are created with these borders. They determine it themselves, and you can't just violate those because you view an ethnicity as the most important to kind of change those with. Yes, I'm mad.
Right. Like basically forced ethnostates, and the idea of an ethnostate is, as Chad has mentioned, is really just the idea that a nation is built upon homogeneity and ethnic purity, purity as they would call it back in 1919. But these ethnostates, these forced ethnostates, which again, it's the post-World War I and the Paris Peace Conference was the first time in history that nations were purposefully built for homogeneity and ethnic purity because they believed that empires that ruled over multiple different ethnicities were too fragile, that people were always going to want to spring for freedom. But the thing is, and then we're going to mention this in the Modern Empire series, is that oftentimes, when people want to separate, based off of their own identities and they create their own nations of ethnically homogenous peoples, then it's going to lead to much more conflict. And we all saw how that ended up post World War One, with the rise of nationalism all across Europe at the time, um, which which led directly to the rules-based international order that we have today post 1945. But point is, forced ethnostates don't last. And to look more into that, the only way to maintain an ethnostate is to reverse the evolution of mankind, as Chad was just about to get to. You would have to force people to stop from traveling to your country with the intention that they might marry or have children with your people and disrupt the purity of your nation. This would mean a total breakup of global community, though, because people are always traveling to different places. That's what modern society is built up out of. The
Hmm.
idea that someone could go to China or go to Germany or Russia, far away places for people in America, and then have children and settle down over there is a very modern idea. But then also not so much so. It is something that is like that has always been there. If you had the capacity to go to a new place thousands of miles away from your home and then go there, you've then disrupted that ethnic purity of the place you've then gone to. So
Yeah.
this
It's
would
also
mean,
way more difficult. I could just hop on a plane in 10 hours, move to Italy, and start an entire new bloodline. In the ancient times, you didn't even have wagons. You had to walk thousands of miles to a new place, join a whole new country, hope that they accept you, and start a new bloodline. In the 21st century, populations and ethnicities moving and intermingling is so incredibly easy and effective and efficient that to create a modern ethno state, you would have to cut that off completely and reverse all the technological and cultural advancements that we've made over the past hundreds and hundreds of years back to the medieval times or way even before that.
right. So it's a total breakup of the global community, because people would not be able to work together. There'd be too much restrictions on where you could go and what you could do in a different place, you know, and because these nations in this scenario would be so focused on their ethnic purity, then you'd have to, or even as they would say, racial purity, because so many people they get them mistaken. Um, uh, so anyway, like now you'd have a state, committed to eliminating its minorities and chart its own policy, which, you might think, oh, a nation is allowed to do what it wants. That just means it's sovereign, but that it's different because ethno-nationalists, they love to say that any complaint of their supremacist policies is a breach of their sovereignty. Like, oh, what are you going to do? This is what we're doing. China, they're denying a lot of what they're doing to the Uyghurs, But even if they were to fully accept what we have found out is going on in those camps, they would say, "Oh, this is just what we're doing in China. What are you going to do to stop us?" But it's a terrible excuse. And of course, the modern rules-based liberal international order post 1945, you know, one, an ethnostate is directly contradictory to that liberal goal. Two, freedom, you know, is very important to have in the modern world to be able to go to another place and to do what you want, you
Marry
know,
who you want, have children, start a community. With an ethnostate, that's out the corner because that's just going to mess with the ethnic purity.
right.
So,
And to
human
restrict
rights
that,
gone.
yes, to restrict that would be like it would be a breach of human rights. It would be evil in a sense, but most importantly, I think number three is that because of like trying to create the borders of this ethnically pure nation, which if you know anything about the Paris Peace Conference, and I hope we can really explore it in depth one day, but it was brutal, because people just could not agree on where these lines were made. I mean, we'd already talked about pieces of it, with Germany, but then also with Italy and its complaints over what they wanted, on the Adriatic frontier, with the new nation of Yugoslavia after World War One. It's brutal, and so, a world of forced ethnic homogeneity upon nations would lead to endless war on all corners of the earth with no progress, no innovation, no hope, and no future.
You know, a state that spends its entire waking effort fighting enemies within and externally. It's just not going to work. That's not how states work. That's not how you progress. That's, as we said, there is not really a future for any of those states, even just realistically and theoretically. And so we wanted to bring that up, the idea, because that is one that, while they may not explicitly say it, that's the goal of ethno-nationalists today, is to create some aspect of a modern ethno-state in which whatever their people are brought into the same country as them, and it does not work. And so in some examples we see very, very terrible explanations of trying to reach this illogical goal. Um, we'll definitely be getting into it in our next episodes. We'll be looking at whether or not some former and current world leaders are ethno-nationalists, and as we said, that includes Vladimir Putin. And
You guys are
as
gonna
it will
love.
be, you will love it.
You guys are
We
gonna
loved
love
we loved
when
going
we
through
rip
it. It
this guy
was
apart. This guy is so funny. Oh my god!
you call that modern comedy.
Will give like all the explanations of why we're joking about this, but it's just that it's so evil because he's so powerful. Someone this evil should not be so powerful,
Someone
but
this evil should not be this stupid either. Like, at
he's
least make it make sense.
so
Goodness gracious.
good. God, my brother in Christ. What
Yeah.
the hell? Okay, all right.
Modern politics is a thing. Well, yeah, so that's about where we're at for this episode. Stay tuned for what we got next. We'll be talking about these leaders in specific, and you're gonna love it. So please stay tuned. We're the Marshals of Truth. Like, subscribe, share, comment on this. Send it to someone who's interested, who's not interested. Run it up. You know what to do.
All right. We are the Marshals of Truth. We'll see you around.